Hey, Dr. Mitch here. We're going to kick it in on the classes and categories lecture. I really appreciate you hanging in there. Just wanted to start with an item. This is markedly more difficult than the ones that I would usually have on an exam because we usually have three items, but then you start looking around. I'm joking. Then obviously you can make sure those aren't the ones you pick. But belladonna, what does that mean? And as you recall in Italian, that means beautiful woman, and that's really just the name of the hallucinogen that tends to increase the dilation of the pupil. We're going to just kick it in on a couple of the categories here and then call it a day. So the inhalants are the one drug category that are a little strange in that we essentially put drugs in there by how they are administered rather than the subjective effect they create. So it's in part because these are volatile, because they're often gases, and you inhale them, that's the way we categorize them. Now, don't get this confused with insufflation, the snorting of, say, cocaine or meth or things like that. Those are not inhalants. It's really got to be sort of a gaseous type of administration, and that's how you know. And the classic ones, nitrous oxide, ether, the glues and solvents, and the nitrites. I really can't recommend any of these. They are pretty harsh. Nitrous oxide is also laughing gas, as you know, but you're basically laughing because your brain is saying, "I need to get more oxygen." Right? It's not funny at all. But NO is taking the place of O on your red blood cells. So clearly, you could hurt yourself, make yourself pass out, things like that. Yeah, using a little bit with oxygen at the same time at the dentist's office is fine, but this is not something you want to make into a habit. Ether was a sedative and a anesthetic at high doses that was used, and we'll get into that when we do this section, but we've got markedly better anesthetics now. The glues, solvents, and aerosols, unfortunately, these were the drugs of choice in Missouri when rednecks in junior high wanted to escape their agony, and it's just not designed for human consumption in any way. They do interfere with oxygen getting into your brain, but they also contain incredible amounts of toxins. It's really harsh. The nitrates I don't see as often. There was a time in the 80s when people thought this was part of a way to enjoy the moment, shall we say, and they were inhalable and tended to make time stand still in curious ways. We don't have a ton of data on long-term use on them in humans, in part because it's often confounded by the use of a lot of other drugs, but you'd know them if you saw them, okay? And if you can recognize these as inhalants, you'll be good for the exam. All right, you may have some of these around your kitchen. I'm hoping it's because your mom likes to make those whipped cream desserts for you, or occasionally, back in the 90s when everybody was making spinach whips and things like that. But bottom line is these are not for human consumption. Can't recommend it. If your roommate has one of these, I think it's understandable that you might be a little bit suspicious. Well, so what are the subjective effects generally? Now, generally, we're going to see laughter just because it's your brain's attempt to get more oxygen, analgesia, and by that I just mean relief from some pain, or ambivalence towards pain, so it hurts but you don't care. Intoxication, a little bit like alcohol, and then vasodilation. So some of the ideal inhalants are going to open up your capillaries, and some of the ones that are prescribed for, say, cardiac problems, and these are really good to have around in an emergency, but again, it's not something you want to do. There are better ways to have fun. Unfortunately, the chronic effects are pretty harsh. So if you're going to have a lot of pressure change in your eye when you do these inhalations and holding your breath and things like that, it does seem to exaggerate risk for glaucoma. And the nitrites themselves contribute to cancer over the years. So folks who abuse nitrates are at risk for cancer tumors, but truth be told, the nitrites in meat that humans consume can also be problematic for that. And then the kidney and liver disease tends to get exaggerated in presence of nitrous oxide. And we see this even in dental workers, dentists and dental assistants. We're not sure if they're necessarily abusing the NO, but they're just kind of around it a lot. So again, we want to make sure you're getting plenty of oxygen whenever you can. Do that aerobic exercise. And this all, in some ways, stems indirectly from hypoxia, at least some of the neuropsych problems. So the brain really needs oxygen. That is exactly what your brain craves, along with some glucose. And hypoxia just means not enough oxygen. And so by all means, these are going to interfere with that in order to create that intoxication experience, but it's because your brain is really just shutting down. It's not a good idea at all. Finally, we do have some other categories, and these aren't just platypi so much as different categories that I'm not going to get into too much detail on this first exam. So the steroids, right, and I don't mean the corticosteroids, but steroids like those muscle building drugs of abuse, over-the-counter meds, and this is another category that's kind of weird because it's just that we decided they were legally available without a prescription or a lot of patriarchal interference, and then the psychiatric meds, the ones that people use that allegedly help psychiatric symptoms, and we're going to have separate chapters on each of these. I just want you to know what they are if you saw the term. So the steroids are essentially ergogenic aids. That just means increases energy or increases performance usually. Now, we're not going to get into this on this exam, but we'll definitely, first of all, learn how to spell hair loss, Dr. Midge. But these do have some long-term negative consequences that I really want to make sure you're aware of. On the right here, we have Dorian Yates. He was Mr. Olympia and Mr. Universe years and years ago. I don't think he's big enough to even compete now. It's kind of curious how that standard has changed over the years. And on the left there is my wife. So here's an item. If I just said, what is hypoxia? Of course, you would pick no oxygen. Now look, you got to read very carefully. Some folks apparently saw this. And the second one, lots of oxygen, they read as loss of oxygen, picked it really quickly, right? So the recommendation here is hold your hand over all the items and just think hypoxia, oh, I know what that is, that's not enough oxygen. Then look down, and if you see it, you're in business. All right, the over-the-counter meds, we do have lots of analgesics, aspirin, naproxen sodium, all of those kinds of things. The non-opiate ones that just decrease pain, often because they decrease inflammation. Right? Weight loss aids, I got to be candid with you. First of all, who eats because they're hungry in the United States anymore? But the ones that are available over the counter, often they're just caffeine or these modest appetite suppressants that you really can't count on as a good plan to lose weight. Feel free to get in touch. But bottom line is, in order to lose weight, you really do have to alter your consumption and change your energy exertion. It's been true for millennia, but nobody likes to hear it. The sleep aids, often the over-the-counter sleep aids are really just antihistamines, so things like Benadryl. And if you look on the side of the bottle, you'll notice that it's diphenhydramine. It's the same as your standard over-the-counter thing for when you're stuffed up, basically. And often the sleep aids are more expensive, and it's kind of silly, so don't rely on these. We'll talk about good sleep hygiene as an alternative, and the cough and cold meds. And truth be told, these don't have particularly impressive data either, but they certainly are available over the counter. So I just thought I'd make a little joke about Big Pharma, but you know, they're doing the best they can to meet their goal, which is to make a lot of money for the shareholders. All right, so psychotropics is another name for psychiatric med. I just want you to know that when you see it. And they tend to include the anxiolytics that we talked about before when we were doing the sedatives, meaning fighting anxiety purportedly. The antipsychotics, meaning, okay, let's handle the symptoms associated with schizophrenia. I've got to be candid. At least in the early days, these were mostly just serious sedation aids, not necessarily decreasing the strange thoughts or the odd hallucinations and things like that. But some folks do seem to benefit on them. And then the mood modulators, okay, so both the lithium type or other ones for bipolar and antidepressants. And I'm not particularly thrilled with the data on those, particularly once you get out to 2-year follow-up. What a surprise. As a psychologist, I think you could do psychotherapy instead. Advertising can ruin your health. Yes, the truth be told, if you do see an ad for a drug today, I am stunned at how prevalent they are. Feel free to email me or just go on Google Scholar and search yourself, because odds are high it is not as effective as the advertisement makes it seem. I just want you guys to be good consumers of research, even if you don't become researchers. The old mother's little helper here. if you're trying to be a woman today, I completely tip my hat to you, and let's think about what really matters, because this notion that you're supposed to bake and cook and clean and have 3 kids who never misbehave or get dirty is just more than I'm sure anybody ever signed up for. Oh, cool. So here's just another sample item. Bottom line being, which of these would you prefer for pain? And of course, you guys would guess opium. I understand maybe wanting one of these other ones as well, but opium is the one. I see some folks making a case for ketamine, so I'm going to leave that alone. But bottom line is, if you see an item on a test from me, go for the opiates for pain. They have some pretty compelling data from both the animal and human literature. And which of these is an inhalant? And again, you could recognize that ether is the one that works that way. Now, which of these is serotonergic? I'm not going to drive you nuts with the individual drugs and what neurotransmitter system do they work in for this first exam, except when we get to the hallucinogens chapter, and we are going to break them up by neurotransmitter system. And again, don't drive yourself nuts with any of the other ones until we get to the relevant chapter. But as you might remember, LSD is the serotonergic hallucinogen on this list. Really appreciate your flexibility on all this. I'll put a link to the Kahoot, which will basically have a whole bunch of questions, at least 10. I also put a crossword puzzle up on Blackboard, so if you want to do that crossword puzzle to make sure you're hammering in some of this knowledge, that'll be great. There isn't really a chapter in Carl Hart's book that gets into these the way I want to, so don't drive yourself nuts trying to find a relevant reading. Just do a good job taking your notes on these, and watch this video again, make sure you write yourself some questions, and start stamping this stuff into memory. Thanks for being along for the ride.